Hello and welcome once again to Telling Stories. I'm Christopher Schultz, and this week we are going to talk about the terrorist attacks in Paris. The theme I'd like to discuss is one of empathy, and not in the sense of empathizing strictly with one group of victims, but rather to think about how those victims should be considered within a much more global historical framework. So here's a very important consideration as we reflect on and try to come to terms with the events that happened in Paris. Um, what happened in Paris is an appalling tragedy, in part because it is so rare. In some parts of the world, drone strikes are a regularity. We in the sort of Western North Atlantic states don't generally experience these levels of violence. So as people reflect on these events and think about sort of how they affect us and how they impact on us, uh, I personally felt very vulnerable, wounded, angered, but mostly saddened, and that those emotions can be exploited to terrible effect. In Nigeria, at the beginning of this year, 2,000 people were slaughtered. In Beirut, the day before the Paris attacks, 40 people were killed in two bombings. These numbers are terrible, and we just don't hear about them. We don't hear about all the collateral damage in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, and that for me is very hard to come to terms with. Because what happened in Paris, as horrific as it was, happens every day in some places. If we're to overcome those feelings, a greater sense of empathy is going to be needed. We are going to need to see through the eyes of the people that we have also victimized. That when a drone strikes a wedding in Pakistan, that we understand that all of the survivors are going to feel the same way that we do today about Paris. This is not an us and them thing. This is an us thing. All of us, people who have been hurt or harmed in some way or another and have felt that there are few options for them. Is it possible to see our own deaths in perspective with the massive civilian death toll of our own military exploits? I am always struck by the way that we report the statistics of our own military deaths. In the Korean War, the Canadian forces suffered 516 deaths, 312 of which were from combat. The Korean citizens experienced 2.5 million dead and injured. The war in Afghanistan claimed 158 Canadian lives. Conservative estimates for Afghanistan put civilian casualties at 25,000. In Iraq, the coalition forces of the United States and Great Britain mostly lost over 5,000 soldiers. There were nearly 500,000 civilian deaths. Why are we so mystified still at the origins of extremist ideologies? There is nothing mystifying about it. If each of these casualties of war has a brother, or mother, or sister, or a father, or an uncle, or a grandfather, or a cousin, or a child, then you are invariably dispersing the hurt. In other words, what we're really describing is a multi-generational trauma that is inflicted every time someone is killed. And so when we mourn 129 killed in Paris, we also have to mourn for the thousands upon thousands who have been killed in other countries around the world, and especially in those places where those people are most vulnerable. So really what I wonder is it possible to be empathetic? Is it possible for us in the North Atlantic, in Western Europe, to really think about what it means to be driven to desperation? Because I read a sign in Paris in the aftermath that said, "Je me sens triste." I feel sad, but life goes on. It's easy to feel that way in Paris, that life goes on. It is much harder to feel that way when your husband or your father or your brother has been taken from you in a place like Afghanistan. If we're going to take the wind out of the sails of these movements, reducing the number of victims has to be of the highest priority. And of course, that means victims of all types around the world. To conclude then, what I'd really like to remind us is those most French principles of liberté, égalité, fraternité. And liberté not merely for the French, but for all subjugated peoples around the world, including those who have been duped by or recruited by ISIS. Égalité between all of the people of the world and how we relate to them and how we speak about them as victims of violence. And fraternité in the sense of keeping our arms open to embrace the people who, like us, are hurting and harmed and angry. So once again, this is Christopher Schultz, and this is Telling Stories. I thank you for joining me this week, and stay tuned for an episode next week. I'd ask that you please subscribe, and I'd be very curious to hear your comments about this story or anything else that's been said on the program. Take it easy, and we'll see you next week.